Chuck Bargeron, who is the director of the Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health at the University of Georgia's Cornell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. Chuck's work focuses on invasive species and information technology. Websites that he has designed have been featured twice in Science magazine and have received over 2 billion hits since 2002. Chuck developed the infrastructure behind Bugwood Images, which runs the forestry-images.org and invasive.org websites. And if you have not seen those, you're missing a lot. We use these everywhere. They're used internationally. They are really important. Recently, Chuck has focused on mapping invasive species and tools for early detection and rapid response using EDD maps and smartphone applications. He has led the development of 73 smartphone applications, including the first apps for the U.S. Forest Service and National Park Service. Chuck has been appointed to the National Invasive Species Advisory Council in 2013 and was elected a chair in 2017. Chuck has been an invited speaker at over 3,000 regional and national conferences and has co-authored over 62 journal articles and outreach publications. He is the past president of the North American Invasive Species Management Association. Welcome, Chuck. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I will jump right in. Thank y'all for joining us today, and hopefully I'm going to give an overview of invasive species issues in the Southeast, both things that we have in Georgia and the surrounding areas and things we need to keep an eye out on. This is very high level, very overview, and please feel free to ask questions when I get done and we can go into more detail, but I'm going to dive right in. So I'm the director of the Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health. And it is a partnership between the College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences and the School of Forestry and Natural Resources. And our work is focused on invasive species, but also integrated pest management and forest health. And a lot of what we do is information technology related, as well as just building partnerships and collaborations to do things better. Start off, we need a definition. So what is an invasive species? So an invasive species is any species that is not any species, including any part of the species, that is not native to the ecosystem that is invading and whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic, environmental, or harm to human health. And just because something, and I'll go into this more later, is non-native, just because it's exotic does not mean that it's necessarily going to be problematic. And that's an important concept to think about as we look at this. Why do we care? It's been estimated that over $138 billion per year in environmental damages, control, and losses are caused by invasive species. And about 400 of the 958 threatened or endangered species are somewhat at risk because of invasive species. And here's a breakdown of that 138 billion and where that kind of falls in. And it's about what you would think. Insects and then microbes are a big part of it, and then plants and mammals and everything else is that those smaller pieces of the pie. And one analogy I really like to make and is for years and years, we've talked about the concept of chemical pollutions and how chemicals come in and cause problems in the environment. But we all know that those chemicals degrade over time. When you look at a biological pollution, most of the cases, unless something is done, the species spread over time. And I think that's the point with invasive species that we forget sometimes is those chemicals are going to degrade. If we don't do something about these plant or animal invaders, they're just going to keep spreading and keep getting worse and worse. So I said this earlier, not all exotic species are invasive. 98% of the U.S. food system is based on introduced species. And we use introduced exotic species for landscaping, for biological control, for hunting and fishing, and for pets, obviously. And I want to make sure sometimes we talk about natives and we talk about exotics, and I want to make sure that just because something is an exotic does not mean it's invasive. So I want to start out with some of the animals. These things get a lot more attention and a lot more notice sometimes just because they're big and sexy and they can get the headlines. And one thing that in thinking about this and talking about this is the illegal, both legal and illegal wildlife trade is huge. And this is where a lot of the problems have come out of the illegal trade, as well as some of the legal with pets that have been released. It is estimated that most of the live species that are imported into the United States are non-native, and it's just hard to catch everything. It's hard to catch everything when you talk about hitchhikers coming in through our ports for insects and diseases, but it's also hard with wildlife for that to be completely regulated. And that leads us to something like the Burmese python. This picture went viral a few years ago where a python was eating an alligator and exploded, and a Park Service pilot saw it and took the picture, and it was really the start to recognizing the python problem in South Florida and in the Everglades. And that problem has just continued to expand over the last 10, 15 years. They keep breaking the record for the largest snake that's been caught in Florida. I saw a headline today about a 15-foot snake that was just lying on the road and on one of the main roads in Everglades National Park. And a few years ago in 2009, they caught a 15-foot, 162-pound one. And that one in particular had 59 eggs inside. When we start thinking about that and these species that are continuing to reproduce and continuing to spread, one was found in 2011 that had a full-size deer in its belly. These pythons have been found swimming in salt water even. And this is really, in my mind, this is data that was done looking at native mammal populations and just the massive drop from what we saw in the 90s to what we have seen in the early 2000s in terms of numbers of these different species. And this is directly related to the increase in the pythons. Luckily, these, and I'm just trying to show some other of what some of these big snakes look like. And this, I think, really captures as good as anything what it takes for that Burmese python to grow to be that 10, 12, 13-foot size. All of the mammals, all the wildlife that it has to eat in order to get to that size. And that's where that real ecosystem impact occurs. Most all of the pythons that have been found have been in the southern part of Florida. That's where there's evidence of them reproducing. We do get an occasional report north of Orlando or even into South Georgia, but most of the time those are assumed to be pet releases, not a breeding population. But we'll keep an eye, especially on Okefenokee Swamp, because that's a huge area. And if we have, especially a few years of mild winters, could be a very good opportunity for the pythons to get established. Also in South Florida, there's a few of the large lizard species that have taken hold. Probably you've seen stuff about the iguanas, especially these last few weeks or earlier in December when it got really cold in South Florida. There's, the iguanas will freeze and fall out of trees, and have actually done some damage and cut some power out to some different communities. But the ones that really, in my mind, that freak me out are, here's a Nile monitor. These are the larger lizards that will pretty much eat everything. And what's really important about these is them and the tegus have been found in Georgia. There's also some populations that have shown up in South Carolina and North Carolina and in Alabama. What is interesting about the ones in Georgia is they have been isolated so far. Most of the catches to Toombs and Tattnall County, Georgia, enough that Georgia DNR really got interested in this, sent a flyer out to all the residents in those counties, and have been really monitoring those areas over the last few years. I think last year there was only maybe one caught. So we're hoping that we've gotten all of those populations, but it was a good wake-up call that these species can move up from Florida, or if they're being bred in Georgia, then getting released, or pets that get released. And a species to definitely keep an eye out on there. They can be very aggressive. And I think that's the piece that people don't realize, that they get them as pets. And just this one in the cage here, they can be very aggressive, and they pretty much eat everything. Another species, which at one point was a huge success story for the invasive species community, is giant African snails. These were introduced in Florida in I think the 50s or 60s. They were actually eradicated. And then a new population has shown up, and they think that maybe it has been eradicated as well. And that's one of the few successes on a species like this. These species they eat pretty much everything, which causes problems, or even eat stucco on homes. And they can carry the rat lungworm, which can cause meningitis in humans. And so that's why this is one that is very much on everybody's radar. They get called, DNR and Georgia Department of Ag will get calls occasionally on suspected, because there's not very many snails that get this big. But luckily there's not been any confirmed populations found out, other than maybe a rare pet found outside of that Miami area, which they think they've about got under control now. But in the 60s, that original populations was found, it cost about $1 million, and there were 17,000 of those that were removed by the time that they were completely eradicated. This new population that started in 2011, they have found over 37,000 of the snails. But again, they think as of a couple of years ago, they have gotten control of these. One of the last animals I want to bring up, just because it in a lot of cases gets ignored as being an invasive species, but it definitely is wild pigs. And this was the hogzilla that was found in South Georgia a few years ago. And there was a lot of controversy over this picture that I won't go into on whether a pig was actually that big. But wild pigs do a lot of damage agriculturally and to the environment. And they have really been, looking at where they were in the 80s compared to how much this population is spread. And there's even now known populations up in Canada, a fair amount in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And so they just continue to spread. And there's a lot of efforts really trying to push back some of these populations. But it gets difficult because people would like to hunt them, but they're not hunting them enough to control the populations. I think this was the 2021 map, which shows a little bit more of an expansion since before. But what really is crazy is in 1982, they were known to be in 17 states, and then now it's over 35 states that they've been documented in. Some other species of interest are some of the aquatic species. I'm not getting into those in these presentations, but there's a whole lot of aquatic plants that can cause problems, as well as the zebra and quagga mussels, which are a real concern being brought in on boats from areas that have been infested. So if you're more interested in that, I can send you more information on some of the aquatic species, but definitely another class of species that we could spend the whole hour talking about. So some of the insects and pest diseases, these are the things that have been introduced over time and have really done a lot of damage. Sometimes we don't even think about these as, again, being some of the older ones being invasive species. Dutch elm disease really decimated the American elm population and still is costing a good amount on an annual basis. American chestnut, the chestnut blight that came in and basically wiped out the American chestnut trees. Again, a pathogen that came in and caused a huge amount of damage. Hemlock woolly adelgid is one that has been spreading and continues to spread. It's about hit the range of hemlocks now, but it's very difficult to get to some of these locations and do something about it. One of the campaigns after Emerald ash borer that was introduced in the 90s came in that has really been a big push is is a campaign around not moving firewood. Burn it where you buy it, or don't move firewood. It changes the whole concept of leave no trace that we were all grew up with, where you bring in your firewood and you don't disrupt anything when you go hiking, when you go camping. And so now a lot of the state parks are selling firewood in order to encourage people to use that local firewood and not bring it in from out of state, just because of the different insects and hitchhikers that can come along with it. And here's just a cartoon illustrating that. And we now have emerald ash borer in Georgia. It was first found in Michigan in 2002. It's a very showy beetle, and larva for that matter. It leaves a pretty distinctive D-shaped hole when it comes out, and will ultimately kill the trees. It's killed over 25 million trees, and is estimated that it could end up costing us 20 to 60 billion if we lose all the ash trees. And here's where it was in 2011, that Great Lakes area, and then you move to more recently, and you just see it's even moving out into Colorado and down into Texas, and we have a fair amount of positive areas in Georgia and in Alabama as well. We've done a lot to try to slow this species down, but it just continues to spread and expand and take out ash trees along the ways. So another one, and I love this picture because it looks like it could be something out of a horror movie, is the Asian longhorn beetle. Asian longhorn beetle is another one that was introduced, fits that longhorn beetle shape, invasive beetle shape. They get to be about 3/4 to 1.25 inches long, and same kind of concept. They will bore into the trees. They came in with packing materials, and they prefer maples, but they have been found on other species. There have been infestations in Chicago, New York, New Jersey, I think one in Ohio as well. And more recently, they were found in South Carolina, not far from the Georgia line. And so we've had some successful eradications, but what a successful eradication means is going in and cutting down all the trees. And so they're working on this population right outside of Charleston. And it appears it had been there for a while, and it just took a while for it to be found and reported, and for them to start doing something with it. It's still not clear exactly how the beetles got there, because obviously it was a fairly big jump. But they are looking at an area that is 73 square miles that they have quarantined, and that they are trying to find any infested trees in that area. The Georgia Invasive Species Task Force, which is made up of the major agencies in the state, University of Georgia Department of Ag, Georgia Forestry Commission, Georgia Department of Natural Resources, as well as working with USDA, APHIS, and Clemson, have put together a series of materials around Asian longhorn beetle, as well as a website, georgiainvasives.org/ALB, where you can get all of this information. But I'm really trying to have materials ready to go. So if this does show up into Georgia, we'll be able to very quickly do the outreach and react to it, versus having to start over from scratch, since we know it's right there on our border. And even a PowerPoint presentation with materials that can be downloaded and pulled in. Another species is laurel wilt, or that is spread by an ambrosia beetle. This originally was found along the coast, and now it's spread near Savannah. But if you have ever seen this, which is the dead red bay trees, that is caused by this beetle that spreads this fungus. And this has been a pretty depressing spread. It really has taken over, and there's some worry about it in avocados in South Florida and in Mexico. So they're trying to really hold the line in Texas for it not to spread down into Mexico. Kudzu bug, which we would assume is a new biocontrol for kudzu that's really going to make a difference and cut down on all these big kudzu populations. And unfortunately, that's not what it is. It just got the name because it was found on kudzu. But It's a square lady beetle looking insect. Once you see one, it's hard to not recognize them. They were first found in 2009. And unfortunately, along with the kudzu and wisteria that they eat, they also will feed on soybeans. And this was something that can cause fairly significant yield loss in soybeans, as well as just being a nuisance if the numbers get up high. This has been an interesting species because it very quickly spread, did not quite get into some of the larger soybean growing areas of the country, but it very quickly spread. And then the population seemed to crash. And in some areas, it's been a long time since we've had any reports of these species coming in. And so it's definitely something to still keep an eye out for, but hopefully something naturally knocked this back before it was able to really get to the parts of the country where they grow a lot of soybeans. Now for the one that everybody's really concerned over, and that is spotted lanternfly. Spotted lanternfly is interesting because we think it needs tree of heaven, which is an invasive plant that we're going to talk about in a minute, in order to reproduce, but then it causes havoc on everything. And the numbers have gotten huge. If you see this one shot right here, those are all spotted lanternflies on the bottom of that tree. This species has shown up in New York, and it was interesting because it is the ones that showed up in New York City. They did a skit about it on Saturday Night Live. They did something on Jimmy Kimmel one night when he was in New York as well. So I guess we figured out how to get a larger public to care about invasive species, let it show up in New York City. But the concern is some of the fruit growing trees and really just having that impact. We're seeing it down in Virginia. I think maybe it has popped up in North Carolina as well. This is about the extent of where it has been found at this point with these internal areas that they're really trying to hold it down in. But when you look at the known distribution of tree of heaven across the United States, this is when it gets interesting because there's a lot of potential for spread of the species just by the means of how much tree of heaven there is out there. And a lot of states are really trying to be proactive on finding where tree of heaven in their state is so they can use that to know where to go look for spotted lanternfly, especially if it shows up. So Illinois is an example of where they knew they had a lot of spotted lantern. They knew they had a lot of tree of heaven. And so to get in front of the spotted lanternfly problem, they went in and did these pretty extensive surveys for tree of heaven and documenting where it was found. All right, so that takes me to the less exciting species, but also the species that we can sometimes do a lot more about, and that is the invasive plants. Kudzu is the one that everybody knows about. It's the poster child, especially in the Southeast, for invasive plants, but there's a lot of other plants that can be real problems. And what I'm going to go through is talking about some of those, one of which these plant species as a whole can invade our crops. They invade our forest. They invade our natural areas. They can invade riparian riverside. They can get into waterways and really clog things up and make it no fun to fish and do other things. We see them growing along roadsides, especially species like kudzu, down under power lines. This is tree of heaven growing under power lines. Old home sites, Japanese honeysuckle growing up on that old home site. Some of them, here's giant reed, or we've looked at as bioenergy crops in buffers and other things. This is not a very impressive population of bamboo in Georgia that, and even around our football stadiums, Chinese privet is what the hedges around the UGA field is. And some of these species, and the story is that it was privet because there's plenty of it growing down by the river and we can go get more if we need it. And it's just that interesting how some of these species are used. I love this picture of the kudzu growing right up to the National Forest sign, and that just shows the extent of some of these problems and how we need to get a hold of them. So going back to those definitions, we have native plants. we have the exotic plants. A lot of the times those exotic plants are the ones sold because in some cases they're easy to grow. And then we have the invasive plants. The difference in an invasive plant and a weed is some of the weeds are native. We do have a lot of native weeds. And so a weed is just a plant out of place. And we do have native weeds, but we also have the invasive plants as well. And how did they get here? How did these plants get here? Well, some of them were accidental introductions as packing materials, as contaminated crops in shipping containers. Kogon grass, one of the species I'm going to talk about in a minute, they think it came in as a packing material. And then other ones that were introduced on purpose. Kudzu is a great example of it was planted for erosion control because we were trying to solve a problem, and here was a plant that would do a good job of solving that problem. I remember as a child that my parents put up a chain link fence and they planted English ivy because English ivy would grow over the fence and they'd have a privacy fence. Years later, I've seen where they've had to cut down all the pecan trees in their yard because that English ivy kept growing up the chain link fence and also up the pecan trees that were nearby. And it was really an interesting example of how some of this stuff really hits home. There's this TENS rule that, of 1,000 plants that are introduced, 100 of them will escape. 10 of those will survive escape, and one of those will become a real problem. And this is a good way of saying that it's not wrong that we introduce these plants. It's not wrong that we have these introduced plants. But at the same time, there are some of them that we need to do a better job of risk assessments beforehand. There's this concept in invasive plant ecology where the population size kind of has this lag phase and then really shoots up. And it's interesting if you look at the known spread of Chinese privet in the South, then that really shows that the realization of that lag phase. And I think this is really the slide that to me sums up everything. When you think about what makes something a good ornamental, and you realize that's also what makes it invasive. It's easy to grow. It does not require a lot of attention. It reproduces easy. It has showy flowers. It attracts birds, and it is disease and pest resistant. Disease and pest resistant because our native diseases and pests aren't tuned in to the species, and that's why it can outcompete and really expand. There's nothing that's too good to be true. And when something is marketed that way, there's probably a reason. And a lot of these species come in from Asia, and that just has to do with the population, with the temperature and the climate being so similar to that part of the world. So what are some plants that we know are causing problems in Georgia? Every couple of years, the Georgia Forestry Commission puts out their Dirty Dozen list of species. And number one is the privet species, and then Nepalese browntop or Japanese stiltgrass, Chinaberry, Lespedeza, kudzu, Chinese tallow tree, which is a big problem, the non-native olives, Japanese climbing fern, English ivy, wisteria, mimosa, and then Callery pear. And then Kogon grass is the 13th species just because they're doing a lot of work to maintain the population of Kogon grass. It's interesting looking at this over time that the Lespedezas, the tallow tree, the olives, English ivy, wisteria, and Bradford pear, we're all seeing a trend where those are increasing over time. So Kogon grass is the one I want to pull out and talk about. It is a perennial grass that can grow up to 6 feet tall. It really dominates when it gets into an area, both above ground and below ground. And these are just some examples of it growing in pine trees, both in the summer and the winter. Very showy flowers. that show up in March through May. This is the roots, the rhizomes that are created. Most of the Kogon grass populations in Georgia have been established from rhizomes. So it is where soil is moved, it's got Kogon grass in it, and then it gets set up in other parts of the state. We, at one point, and unless something has changed, none of the seed that is produced from those seed heads has been shown to be viable in the populations in Georgia. And that's because of how it reproduces and needing a couple of different clones. So it's getting moved with equipment from one place to another. It is a huge fire and smoke hazard just because of how hot it burns, and it can really cause issues. So in Georgia, the effort to really get a hold on Kogon grass started around 2006. And at that point, we knew about 20 sites in 10 Georgia counties that had Kogon grass. And an effort was put together. A bunch of agencies came together, as well as the university, to help with the outreach. And over the next 6 years, we saw the number of known Kogon grasses in Georgia just really jump. That was not because it started spreading that much. It was because of the outreach that was done. People knew more about it. That more people reported it. And that's how we found out about that we had a lot more Kogon grass than we realized. It's still pretty isolated to the southeast corner of Georgia. We now are up to over 16 sites, but the good part about it is that 86% of those spots in Georgia are negative now. And so where we have a lot more sites, the education worked. We found out more about Kogon grass, and we're able to get a hold of it. And the Forestry Commission is spending the time and effort every year to go in and treat that for landowners at no cost. And so it's been a great program, and it's great to see this kind of success. They've had the last couple of years, the last 2 years have been two of the highest reported years for new finds. And we don't know if some of that is related to the after effects of Hurricane Michael, which came right through that Southwest Georgia area. The largest spot treated, just a few highlights here. Largest spot treated in 2021 was 5 acres. Most of the spots are pretty small now, and 34 to 7, about half the counties are now negative for Kogon grass. And like I said, there was a lot of outreach done, little cards that were put together, as well as a field guide to identify it. And this has been an effort between the U.S. Forest Service and the Georgia Forestry Commission to make it where things can be shared. I want to wrap up with something that was put together that I really think sums up what we can do very easily to make a difference when it comes to invasive plants. And this was something that the Garden Club of America and the Park Service and Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, as well as the National Invasive Species Council, put together almost 20 years ago now, but it's still very relevant. So the first thing is to know your plants, know when something is an invasive, know when something is a native. If you do have invasive plants in your landscaping, in your yard, then keep an eye on them and keep them under control, and ultimately try to remove them. Use the non-invasive alternatives, whether those are natives or exotics. Watch out for hitchhikers, that whether it's aquatic hitchhikers or whether it's native hitchhikers moving. If we go from one water body with all of this on our boat motor, as soon as we put that into the next water body, they're going to have that same weed there that they may not have had before. If you share plants, make sure you're sharing things that are or do not include invasives. Use seed mixes that are invasive plant free. You can find those. You can find weed-free soil and mulch that can be put out. One way that Japanese climbing fern is getting moved a lot is through pine straw. And so keep an eye on the pine straw and look for Japanese climbing ferns so it does not get moved into your landscaping. Aquatic plants, people love to have their backyard ponds, whether they're artificial or otherwise, and be especially careful with those because those are some of the ones that can really cause a problem. Keep an eye out for new sprouts and volunteers that would show up in the landscape. Take the extra effort to dispose of the plants carefully. And if you've got this plant, like maybe the hedges at the University of Georgia Stadium, or something in your own yard that you have to keep because it means something to you, then just keep an eye on it and make sure that you try to contain it as much as you can. I had a slide in here, and I took it out, but I think it's important. The concept of see something, say something. The northern giant hornet, the Asian hornet, the murder hornet that was found in Washington, if it was not for somebody going, oh, wow, this is a hornet. This is the largest hornet I've ever seen. Let me figure out what to do about it. And they went to Reddit. They didn't get an answer on Reddit. And luckily, they found the Washington Invasive Species Council's app, uploaded a picture of it, and then Washington Department of Ag was able to go, oh, wow, that is the northern giant hornet, as it's called now, and we need to do something about it. And it's that kind of mentality of just seeing something unusual and going, hey, what is this? And I guarantee you the people working in the field, they don't mind getting those emails because they know that, hey, you're at least trying to find something that you haven't ever seen before. And for more resources on these species, we have created a website called invasive.org. It has a lot of information about and pictures about different species found all across North America, and that are all free to use and free to download. And then we've also created a system called EDMAPS, which stands for Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. And its singular goal is to make it very easy for people to report things. And then when they report, whether it be a plant, an insect, or an animal, through the website, that report going to the correct group that is responsible for that. If you're in Georgia and you report it, then it goes to one person. If you're in Alabama and report something, it goes to somebody else. If you're in Wyoming on vacation and you see something that looks unusual, then it goes to the appropriate person in Wyoming. We built this so the user doesn't have to think about it. They can go to the website, fill out a form, or they can download the smartphone app. Just look for it in the Apple or Google Play stores. It's free. There's a couple of different versions, but just look for the main EDMAPS version. It'll let you choose the state you're in and download the species relevant for you in that state. And then, and you can change that when you do go on vacation. And then you can report things when you can save them to your phone when you're offline. And then when you get back to having service, you can upload those. And every one of those reports gets looked at by an expert. It helps to have a picture, obviously, and then they react to it appropriately. Obviously, for me, I think invasive species are one of the largest and most important environmental issues that we need to do more about because we never know what the next species to look out for is going to be. And with that, we can do questions. Here's my email address, and feel free to reach out to me if you have other questions or want to know more about something that I mentioned today.
Thank you, Chuck. And we are waiting to see if questions will come. Welcome questions. You can use the chat or you can use the questions and answers. I will read to Chuck and he will answer any questions you might have. I'm going to just use the opportunity to say that I have worked with the Georgia Exotic Plant Pest Council for years, and it's been really remarkable to see how 15, even 20 years, I've been at UGA for 22 years, how much the public awareness has grown over this time in terms of just being aware of the problems that invasive species, and the damage that they can cause. I don't think that, like you were saying earlier before you started this webinar, this almost has become part of school curricula across the country to where even elementary level kids actually learn about that. So that's great. That's great because we need everyone to step up to this plate and really help.
Yeah. it's interesting that this is still the overall concept of invasive species is still relatively new. The executive order that was signed was in 1999, and that was really what kickstarted a lot of these efforts. There's always been pieces of it and groups that did things about ag pests or forestry pests, but really trying to coordinate that and look at the problem as a whole is relatively a new thing. And yeah, it's been amazing to watch it expand.
We have a question from Mary Morse. What about the hammerhead worm? That's a great question.
Yes. And the interesting part on the hammerhead worms is that nobody really knows enough about them to know if they're going, what impact that they're having. And it's something we really need to. It's amazing how many of them are out there just based on the emails and phone calls we will get about them. But nobody is really sure because there's just so little knowledge on the hammerhead worms, what their long-term impacts are. We're seeing some huge impacts with different earthworms and really affecting things. And we're just not quite sure with the hammerhead worms what their impact is other than them being these big scary things. And obviously I left out Spider, which has been the talk of so much recently, but even Spider, we can't even get agreement within the University of Georgia on whether it's a problem or not, or going to be a problem or not. But it is an exotic. It's not from here, but whether it does damage is where we're still trying to figure that out. But yeah, it is definitely another showy one. And I'd almost put the hammerhead worms in that same bucket of we just don't know enough about them yet.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was really interesting. I was actually snapping a picture of that pyramid. I thought of as like a protein pyramid of the python, how much meat protein it takes to feed that top predator. And it's just, it really, we have all these species and it seems like we have we're moving toward world of no boundaries and people are moving, traveling, and seeds, animal microorganisms and higher organisms get unintentionally moved around, and it goes with this period of like slow and everything is like under the radar. You don't know how much is, where it is, and then you start seeing it and you get reports, and then all of a sudden it's like everybody's talking about it. It's important to stay on the top of the information and find out as much as possible. I have EdMaps on my phone, and I highly recommend for those of you who haven't looked at it to do so and get actively engaged, because those reports are the ones that can really help Forestry Commission, DNR, the federal agencies involved, the cooperative extension, the scientists, and industry people that are stepping up and helping with the eradication of those species. Please look it up. And if you have any questions, send them to Chuck. Here is his email. I'm going to give a couple more minutes for people to come up with some questions. So far, we've had really just great presentation, very informative, really enjoyed it. Lots to learn, though. Lots to learn for sure.
And I will say the best way to, whether it's spiders or hammerhead worms or the next potential problem, is by using something like EdMaps to report it. iNaturalist is another way you can report things. We pull data from iNaturalist into EdMaps of invasive species, but that's giving us that knowledge. And that one python that may show up in the Okefenokee, okay, that's a pet release. But once we get more and more of those kind of reports, that's when we start to worry about it and having that documentation of where things are. I was in a meeting earlier and they were talking about somebody called and said they saw a spotted lanternfly. It was a truck driver, and they weren't exactly sure where it was that they saw it. It just landed on their truck somewhere in Georgia. And just if they had taken their phone and taken a picture of it and we had that GPS, how much more information we would have had to have been able to follow up on that than just the vague information. That's the nice thing about having the picture and having the GPS that comes with the phone.
Absolutely.
I say they invented the iPhone and Android just to give us an easy tool to report invasive species. I think that was part of it.
I actually just, whenever I just sit around and doctor's office or somewhere else, I just pop it up and start looking at images and just try to get as much information, because it's like there are all these records that come in and update the information, and you're like, wow, I didn't know it was in this county or that county, or how close to my house is this. So
it was amazing. I have a picture and that I'll show sometimes, and it's the USDA plants database distribution for Japanese honeysuckle when we started the EdMaps project, and it was probably in 15 counties in Georgia. And now we've got it documented in every county in Georgia. And just how much knowledge we didn't have. We knew it was everywhere. We just didn't have the documentation that it was everywhere. And that's been maybe we could never eradicate Japanese honeysuckle, but at least we know better how big the problem is than what we did originally.
Yeah, just the knowledge of what is non-native and which one of the non-native is a potential problem or is a big problem is very important. And I urge people to talk to their neighbors, to get involved with their homeowner associations, master gardeners, reach out to cooperative extension, just get a lot of information that exists out there, whether it's a snippet for social media or some public service announcements that have been prepared for you. And if you want to, spread out the knowledge that we can give to the public, we're here for that. All right. Seems like there are no questions. And thank you again, Chuck, for this very informative and enjoyable, in a way, presentation. So thank you for starting us off.